Hello, everyone. This is La. Bit over 2 years ago, I did my big brother and race ethnicity since they like to confuse the two, but that's besides the point. Decided to make a few videos pertaining Big Brother and races, and the first group of people that I covered were Black people, but I divided them into gender. The first one was about Black women or people of Black descent, and the second video was about Black men or people with Black descent. And this video, I'm going to combine them all, kind of like how we did with the other racial slash ethnic groups. I've already discussed how annoying it is that Big Brother, or CBS specifically, because they're the ones who approve of the casts, always confuse ethnicity and race, and they tend to one drop people, which is very, very annoying. But we will talk about all that throughout the video. And it was kind of interesting because when I did those videos, especially with the women, Big Brother 24 wasn't finished yet, and I do regret not waiting until that season finished. So not only do I have a lot to update on based off the Big Brother 25 and 26 casts, but with the Big Brother 24 cast as well, since their journeys weren't complete for the most part, when I published those videos, and I'm probably going to add some more commentary about the other seasons as well, or the other house guests in the other seasons as well. So that'll all be interesting. One thing that I am going to do is I am going to divide them into three different groups of people because people of Black descent obviously have different experiences, and those different experiences should be addressed. So the first one are monoracial and ambiguous Black people. These are people who aren't mixed, they aren't seen as anything but Black, and they're obviously Black. The second group that I'm going to talk about are mixed people. So these could be biracial people with Black and white, Black and Asian, or they're just heavily mixed through a few generations. But generally, I'm going to be talking about biracial people. And the third group of people are exotical people. If you don't know, there's this huge community on YouTube and the internet when it comes to more racially ambiguous or more ambiguous Black people. These could either be people who are multi-generationally mixed, or they benefit from at least one of the isms. So they either have looser hair texture, which is texturism, they have more non-Afrocentric facial features or a phenotype, so that's featureism, or they're very, very, very light skinned. So these are people who might be monoracially Black, but they're a bit more ambiguous, or they could be mixed. In general, I'm not going to put that many people in here, but people who I'm a bit unsure of, I'll probably put in there. So obviously, I'm going to go into chronological order, and we'll go from there. So we're going to start with William from Big Brother 1, and it's rare that I talk about Big Brother 1 in general. So there's a lot of awkwardness with this one. He was very pro-black and wanted to talk about it since he was a part of the Black Panthers, but no one was interested in hearing his perspective on everything. He was seen as aggressive, angry, and irrational, not only just with his behavior, which was filled with microaggressions, based off of how some of the other house guests saw him, but him wanting to strategize was also villainized as well. Because this was Big Brother 1, this was a popularity contest and they wanted to come off as likable to America, and they thought that strategizing was villainous and was something that America would hate. With this in mind, he would be the first boot of the season. Virtually all the argument of the season involved him. Cassandra had to tell him that he needed to be a quote-unquote polite Black man in so many words so he could adapt. There are many situations and times in the Black community where we are told to tone ourselves down and to hold back just so we can make people feel comfortable, even if we aren't doing any uncomfortable actions ourselves. So I am going to talk about Cassandra from Big Brother 1. First, I do want to say rest in peace to Cassandra since she, at this point of my recording this, is one of the two Big Brother house guests who have passed away from USA. Obviously, I didn't watch the entire season of Big Brother 1 just because I got so bored. And there are way too many episodes. I believe there's like 50 odd episodes, and there's really nothing going on. But she and Will are the first example of two Black people interacting with one another on Big Brother USA. And I found it to be very interesting where she tried to give him a lot of advice on how to navigate through the house, his actions, and all of that. And she's clearly talking to him in a way that the others couldn't, because obviously they share the same race, and they're both in this environment where the only two black people who are around a bunch of non-black people. And you can tell that Cassandra was kind of used to dealing with a lot of non-black people, not only just due to her career, but just the way she carries herself, where I don't know if this is the right terminology or the right wording of it, but it seemed like she kind of wanted to be the quote unquote good black person, where she was very serviceable, she was very timid, mild mannered, but very intelligent as well. So I definitely saw that within her and Will's interactions. And she continued acting that way once Will was out and she had to navigate through the season. So that's just my little commentary there. And I forgot to mention her in the last video I did because I generally don't talk about Big Brother 1, and I guess I just didn't feel like including her there, though I definitely should have in hindsight.
And now I'm going to move on to Monica. Throughout the season, a lot of house guests acted like she was worthless, didn't do anything, and didn't deserve to win because they felt like she wasn't worth it and she was kind of just a waste of space. There's also a lot of times where they acted like she was stupid and illiterate at various points throughout the season, kind of hinting that she was uneducated. I do remember in her final week, there was this argument that she had with Nicole about what quote unquote light skin is, and Nicole didn't really understand the nuances of why Monica, as a black woman, would get offended at that, and Nicole kind of just laughed it off. She mentioned several times that she had to tone down her personality so she wouldn't be seen as loud or ghetto, since if she was her normal personality, she would have been booted a long time ago. When she would make comments about saying that a black girl wasn't going to win, the house guests didn't understand where she was coming from, and it was just very awkward to watch at times. It seemed like things didn't really turn around for her, unfortunately, until her cousin was murdered in 9/11. And even when she won the HOH in the Final Four, people didn't really think of it as a big deal since she made the obvious move. So many others said ridiculous things or didn't make sense a lot of the time, but it was Monica that was always pointed out for it.
2024 me talking. Monica mentioned a few times that some of the house guests clearly didn't interact much with black people throughout their lives. So there's definitely a huge cultural clash there. And that's something that I've noticed quite a bit with a lot of these earlier BB house guests. And I wouldn't be surprised if Monica herself didn't interact with a whole lot of non-black people either. So I think there's a cultural clash from both sides. And she definitely had to work twice as hard to not only just remain herself, but to remain a presentable version of herself. And while this is something that house guests generally do in Big Brother, they're not doing it due to racial or cultural reasons. They're usually doing it solely for gameplay purposes, especially during this earlier part of Big Brother, where Monica was doing it for many other reasons, and a part of that was definitely due to her race and gender. It didn't seem like she and Autumn were that close or that distant from one another, but it was interesting to have two of them in the season, though Autumn didn't last anywhere near as long as Monica did. But I also think they had different experiences because one, Autumn was more sexualized. Two, she was younger. And three, I just think they have different types of emotional strengths. So their experiences were different, despite them obviously having different physical appearances as well.
So now it's time to talk about Marcellus. So there was the very awkward situation in the first week where he was potentially isolated by the all white alliance, which just happened to have been Caucasian, for being gay and black. In addition to that, there was Jerry who wanted to be the quote unquote white savior, which just made things so much worse with the veto situation. Marcellus could tell that he was being isolated, and some of the ways that Josh would describe Marcellus was very weird. And with the situation, Jerry himself admitted that he had prejudices. So Clearly, maybe this entire situation was just projection on his part, but there could have been a very real possibility that he was isolated because of his race. And of course his sexuality as well, but this video is specifically talking about race. And the worst part of it is that this was dangled like a toy for game purposes, which kind of sucks because this is what happened 20 years later in the current season. So we're dealing with similar situations. So Roddy was mad in the final six when Marcellus nominated him for eviction, and Roddy goes to the backyard to mansplain very condescendingly to Marcellus and Danielle, where Marcellus essentially calls him out in the diary room for mansplaining to the two black people in the house, like he, meaning Roddy, was superior to them, and like they, Danielle and Marcellus, didn't know any better. So he felt the microaggressions coming from Roddy. So in All Stars, he was isolated again, and all the men disliked him for some weird reason. But I don't know if this had anything to do with race, sexuality, etc. There was the situation during Kiara and Josh's fight in week 5, where Josh told Marcellus that he would have went home in the first week had Terry not feeded him, and it caused Marcellus to have to relive that trauma and cried about it, which led to the fight between Kiara and Josh.
So this is 2024 Lala talking, and I do want to talk about his interactions with Danielle. And it's ironic since they both played all their Big Brother seasons together, so this is very interesting. With Marcellus and Danielle, they obviously felt some sort of kinship together due to them being of the same race and being the only ones on both of their seasons who have the same race. But there was definitely some tension because Marcellus kind of saw through Danielle's tactics and Danielle kind of saw through Marcellus's tactics. But as we got closer and closer to the end of Big Brother 3, especially, Danielle kind of started weaponizing their race to get him to stay loyal to her when she had every intention of stabbing him in the back, where she talked about them being on the cover of Essence magazine if they were in the final two, damn well knowing that she was planning on cutting him, not only cutting him, but convincing him to not use the veto that he won so she could scumbag him on live TV. And I think that's why Marcellus was so hurt and so bitter, especially because she essentially weaponized being black against him to force some unwarranted loyalty, only for her to stab him in the back in some of the most brutal ways in Big Brother history. Still, over 20 years later. And it adds more context because once they got onto All Stars, they were still gunning for one another due to all of their history together and them both yet again being the only black people on their season. But they worked through their relationship on the show. But when she voted him out on All Stars, he understood where she was coming from this time, and it wasn't really set in Becky as well. I find it interesting because I believe he was on Watch What Happens live a bit after Big Brother 24 ended, which was literally 20 years after Big Brother 3, and Andy was asking him about Taylor Hale's win. And Marcellus mentions that he and Danielle could have been the first Black final two 20 years ago, since Monty and Taylor were the Black finalists on Big Brother 24, but Danielle was the one who stabbed him in the back. So he definitely still remembers it. So it adds some context regarding his race, interacting with other black people on the show, and how it affected him on both of his seasons.
Now we're going to move on to Danielle from Big Brother 3. She was immediately on the outs, while most of the pretty white people aligned with one another in the first few weeks. I think this was partially because she was quote unquote older. Not that she was older, but because she was a mother, and people tend to see mothers as older in this warped way. And it also didn't help that Marcellus, the only other black person, was targeted to go home, and there's a whole discussion about that in the Big Brother 3 house that ended up happening. I remember there's a situation in the final six where Roddy was nominated by Marcellus, and he approaches Danielle and Marcellus to pretty much question and haze them. He started mansplaining them and talking to them like they were stupid, how they didn't understand, and I was very uncomfortable to watch. Like he thought they were lesser than for whatever reason, and how he didn't deserve to be treated this way, and he just had this superiority with them. And I remember Marcellus even called it out in the diary room, where it just looked bad that this white man was treating these two black house guests like they were really stupid. And of course, there's the discourse in the final two, which could be interpreted as misogynoir, as she played the game, she outplayed everyone. Most of the house guests loved her while she was in the house, but she didn't get a single vote outside of Jason, and they kind of villainized her for playing the game. I know many people interpreted it as this and compared her game to Dr. Wells in the prior season, where he was praised for playing this way. There's a whole discourse about it that is still discussed today and was a huge factor as to why the cookout was formed to begin with. I could go on and on and on about this situation. So we skip a few years and a few seasons, and we're going to go back to Danielle, but in Big Brother 7. The main thing that she had to do in this season was play herself down, which meant toning down not only her gameplay, but her personality, especially due to the events that happened in Big Brother 3 and how much hatred she got for it. A lot of black house guests, especially women house guests, have to tone down their personality to avoid stereotypes and tropes, and she didn't want to be villainized like she was in her last season. There was the event that caused her to be nominated and how she reacted very emotionally to Erica, where she was very mad at her for thinking about nominating her. No, Erica pretty much told Danielle that she was nominated to her, and Danielle was locked out of the HOH room as she wanted to talk to Erica one more time, and everyone kind of made her look like she was crazy when she didn't really act that crazy. She was just emotional, she was in her feelings, and she couldn't believe that something so stupid was happening to her. Just watching that all happen was kind of uncomfortable. And of course, when a black person shows their feelings, they're always deemed as crazy, emotional, so on, so forth, and it was always made to seem negative.
So, before me here, I think Danielle in this discourse is very interesting. Obviously, she is a monoracial, unambiguous, darker skinned black woman who is married to a mestizo or a white Mexican, and she has multiracial or biracial children. And she lives in an area in California where it's very multicultural and multiracial. So she has experience dealing with a lot of non black people in her everyday life. And I do think that is a reason as to why she thrived so much in Big Brother 3 when it comes to dealing with all of the white people on the show compared to Marsalis, even though she was on the outs for the first few weeks and she kind of just let things self destruct after those first few weeks. And I also think that is why she and Marsalis kind of handled things differently and why she was honestly kind of able to weaponize blackness to put Marcellus in this false sense of security and then stabbed him in the back in the brutal way that he was. Obviously, there was her loss that was portrayed very horribly, and people deemed it as her being a black woman as to why she lost. And while that could very well be a factor where it's like, how dare this black woman backstab all of us, treat us any sort of way, and not really regret it. And I do think over the years she's kind of come to that type of resolution, and I noticed her commentary about seasons that happened well after her time on the show, kind of affecting her. Like, I know she talked about the Jody boot and how black people, especially black women, tend to suffer a lot. So it seemed like she was kind of coming to terms with how race does have an impact on certain things, where she was kind of mum about it. And I did notice how during her meltdown, during her final week on Big Brother 7, it's kind of seen as like, oh, let's hide from this crazy black woman. Or at least that's how it was edited. So even there, you could kind of see some of the nuances with that as well. But she was the standard for so long when it comes to black people in general as a Big Brother player, and she's still kind of that as well, even though she never herself claimed to be very pro black herself, or at least during the time she was on the show, though that might have changed over the years, but it adds more nuance.
And now we're going to move on to Marvin. So he was a very unique casting choice since they generally do not cast black men like him in general, who was just very opinionated but very quirky as well and had a very dark sense of humor that wouldn't be palatable for the CBS audience. So I always found it weird that Marvin wasn't included in the Four Horsemen alliance, despite him wanting to work with them and sending Glory home on his HOH. Outside of that, they actively planned to target him when he could have been a very useful number for them, especially with what happened to the all-white Four Horsemen alliance in the succeeding weeks. So that kind of alienation was just very odd, and it just shows that people work with who they feel comfortable with. So a lot of his behavior in the house made the other house guests uncomfortable, but I don't know if it had anything to do with his race per se. His comments were overboard and were a lot to do with at times, which has not aged well, especially with some of his flirty antics. So there was the situation with Adria claiming that she used the Bible to make her nominations in week 6, which had horrible optics because a black man and a gay man was put on the nomination block, and they are two minorities, though for very different reasons. Marvin didn't handle it well and called her out on using that card and the other microaggressions that she played a part in transpiring all week. They had several arguments about it during the entire week. And then in the finale, he accused Cowboy of either being a racist liar or a lying racist. Clearly, this was some feed stuff that wasn't on the episode and got lost in the archives since a lot of the stuff that happened on the feeds from those days aren't easy to find on the internet. But the fact that he said this clearly felt that he felt some microaggressions or some other potentially racist antics from Cowboy. But this also could have led to my first point that I mentioned about him being excluded from the Four Horsemen Alliance. So that could tie together in that way.
So it's 2024 Lala. So I am even more mixed on Marvin now than I was 2 years ago when I first made this video, or I released the first version of this video. Obviously, when it comes to his overtly flirtatious behavior and him outright admitting on the feeds that he nominated Lori and Harvey because they reported him to production regarding how he made them feel regarding his flirting and inappropriate touching, it's really just a horrible look. Not only just for him as an individual and him as a man, but him being the first straight black man on the competitive Big Brother, and I'm saying that because I know Will's before him, but that wasn't competitive. It really set a very bad precedent, and he really didn't really take any accountability for it, or at least at the time. And he didn't really care to think how that would look when it comes to black male representation. At the same time, I do appreciate that he calls stuff out for what it is. He calls people out for their microaggressions or their macroaggressions right from the start. He doesn't really sugarcoat it, and he is very upfront with his blackness, where I feel like a lot of the black people in the future or after him that I will get into, they intentionally cast them to be quote unquote the safe or the token black person who is all about toning down what makes them black. But we'll get more into that when I get to those specific people.
So the next person that I'm going to discuss in chronological order is Bo. And honestly, there isn't really anything notable in my opinion, but I don't know if it was due to him being under edited on the actual show, and like I mentioned with Marvin, a lot of the feed archives were lost. But the fact that he was under edited is interesting because he was a more subdued, quiet guy, and they like to cast their Black House guests to be very obnoxious, but it was a double flipped coin with him because they also like casting their gay men to be very obnoxious. And because he didn't fit into that stereotype for either categories, he was under edited.
So, this is 2024 me coming around, and I find it interesting that allegedly, emphasis on allegedly, Eric and Maggie made some commentary about how they, as a fireman and a nurse, would either take their time to help certain people that come from certain neighborhoods that fit certain demographics. I'm wondering if they said this around Bo and how Bo reacted when some of these, or if some of these things came out. So that's kind of interesting, or at least in my mind. It also seems like his sexuality was more of a focus than his race when it comes to his experience on Big Brother, and that tends to happen with people who fit into a lot of categories, and that's how intersectionality comes into play. There was also that beef that Marcellus apparently had with Bo behind the scenes, where he didn't really embrace Bo because he thought Bo would take his slot as the black gay person on CBS, though I don't know why Marcellus was worried because Marcellus was a lot more charismatic than Bo, so he really had nothing to be afraid of, and it just shows how competitive that a lot of people who share similar archetypes are with one another, even though they're not even on the same season.
So we're going to move on to a season and talk about Jamaica from Big Brother 8. She did talk about how uncomfortable it was for her to be in the house as the only black woman and the only black person in general, especially since she wasn't brought up in an area with a lot of white people. From what they showed on the episodes, it seemed like everyone kind of understood this, but the fact that she even had to discuss it showed how she felt entering the game and within the first few weeks. Of course, Eva Dick used her religion as an attack when she did not vote out Eric, which he wanted to in week 5, and he kept making fun of it. Religion is generally always seen as a huge thing with the Black Houseguests in Big Brother, which I think is heavily pushed by production and the network, but is never seen as such a huge thing in other ethnicities or races. When you think of the church and when you think of gospel and all the stereotypes that comes with it, usually black people come up. So the fact that he kept on picking at her religion was not the best look. Jamaica is also another person who had to tone down herself and her personality in order to make it far, and she tried her best to not play into the quote-unquote angry black woman stereotype. So, chronologically, the next person is Parker. So, casting interviewed all the house guests before they cast them, clearly, and they knew that Ryan had an issue with interracial relationships, which is problematic enough on its own. With Ryan's real life girlfriend, Jen, being on the show, the producers decided to put her in a pair with Parker, the only black man on the show, to cause some drama with Ryan since he hated that she dated a black person in her past. So they set up the situation that would cause drama using racial lines involved, and it put Parker in a very vulnerable and dangerous situation where he could have potentially gotten heat from someone else's racism, essentially. So outside of that and how casting set him up, essentially, he was immediately seen as shady to the house guests, and Jacob led a charge against Parker, which was only an issue because Parker was in power, so they all sold him out. He was always seen as someone who was dramatic when he didn't even cause any of the drama that happened in the house and was nowhere near the most dramatic person in the house. But because of his race, it was always amplified with him, and he was always seen as dramatic, hence him being booted first, in addition to all the Jen stuff. With Libra from Big Brother 10, and this is a big one, but I don't really see many people talk about it overall. So one of the first things that I noted was that Steven called her the colored girl, like we were in 1945, instead of calling her by her name. Jerry also made a lot of suspicious comments against Libra that was definitely rooted in some microaggressions. So the entire house acted like she was this quote-unquote mastermind, and everything that happened in the house was blamed on her, and they were all obsessed with evicting her when Libra wasn't doing anything any differently than most of the other house guests. The house guests continuously called her a bad mother for doing the show and called her a bunch of curse words and slurs. She was constantly gaslit in several arguments, and no one felt bad for her, no one protected her, no one really understood her side. And whenever there was an argument, they went to her. When the house did flip on Jessie, why was she the main one that was being attacked by the other side when there were 3 other people who voted that way? But it was mainly Libra who caught all the smoke. April pulled out the motherhood card, claiming that Libra swore on her kid and broke it, which Libra claims she didn't, and Ollie called Libra a scallywag, with Jerry and Michelle also yelling a bunch of nasty things about her and to her, which continued throughout a majority of the week. And there was the feast fight, where Libra made a joke and the entire house, mainly the woman, turned it into something that it wasn't. Keisha used her victim tears that she consistently used against Libra, even going back into the second week, which finally caused her to have a meltdown. Of course, they didn't really show most of this argument on the feeds. It was mainly just Libra being consistently gaslit by Michelle, and April kind of throwing in her side comments as well. And it got so bad to the point where she started breathing heavily and wanted to go into the diary room. And Keisha was also cursing Libra out as well. Libra could not win under any circumstances. She really had no one in her corner, and there was clearly a lot of misogynoir that she dealt with throughout the entire season that goes underreported.
So this is 2024 me. And looking back at it, what made her different than April or especially Keisha when it comes to their actions? All of them were very volatile women who were very cutthroat, strategic, and did what they wanted to do. But they never got anywhere near the same amount of flack as she did. The only difference that I noticed is their skin color. And it didn't help that the edits definitely wasn't on her side and definitely wanted to make her look as guilty as possible as well. I also remember Ollie making commentary to April about how he's a different type of black person than Libra, talking about how his skin color was so much lighter than hers when they're literally the exact same skin color. So stuff like that really just rubbed me the wrong way. And it's interesting because when some people watch these recent seasons and talk about how things were so bad, they really didn't look at these older seasons to see that these black women on these older seasons were treated so much worse than some of these newer house guests that they like to pedestalize and act like it's an angel. But we'll get there when we'll get there.
Okay, so the next person is Ollie, and here was around the time when they started pushing the religious black person edit, and producers heavily pushed his religion on the edit, and somewhat made it seem like a joke from how it was portrayed and edited on the show. On the feeds, he apparently made some comments about not being quote unquote that type of black person, and compared his skin tone to Libra's like he was better than her, and he would always put himself in a position where he was an accepting black person compared to Libra. And of course, he called Libra a scallywag, which made it on the edit and was just horrible. So, we're going to move on to a season and discuss Chima. So, the predominantly Caucasian side of the house decided to target her the very first week, since she was quote unquote dramatic, though most, if not all, the drama that happened in that week did not involve her. Of course, this is the same side of the house that acted like Chima had absolutely no right to be mad about her HOH being dismantled by nothing of her own doing and gaslit her about it. She was called a quote unquote loudmouth, which she not necessarily wasn't a loudmouth, but most of the cast were loudmouths in that season, but they only called her that. And a bunch of other microaggressions were thrown at her, like some of the house guests that didn't fit the description. And all of this happened before Microphone Gate. I also want to state that Chima is very problematic in other ways, and she definitely contributed some unwarranted racism against Russell. So I just wanted to bring that into conversation so people aren't acting like I'm excusing everything she did as well.
So 2024 and I have some additional context here. I do remember during that big fight with herself and Russell, he said to go use your big ass lips to suck some DICK, because that's all they're good for, and that's also very problematic. Just looking at the history of black women and them being overtly sexualized, especially regarding their lips by other people, whether they were black or non-black, going through slavery days or even them in Europe. It's just a really, really nasty history. And the fact that he said that to her really just rubbed me the wrong way. Though, like I mentioned then and now, she made some bad commentary towards him as well. Also, why was she the only one called a loudmouth out of all the women on the season? Lydia and Natalie were very loud. They got into several confrontations throughout the season. Heck, even Michelle did as well. Same with Jordan and Laura, but that term was only used towards her, the only black woman on the cast. I didn't like that at all either. I'm not saying Shima isn't loud. She definitely was loud, but she wasn't the only loud woman on the season. But she was the only one who was coined, or who had that term coined towards her.
So with Keith, he wasn't around long at all, clearly since he was a week one boot, but he was still portrayed as loud and obnoxious. Also, his religion was also a huge focus and was portrayed as some sort of joke, like it was with Ollie and a few other black women house guests.
So, for me, I do remember that his eccentricity and his way of speaking definitely came off as aggressive to the other house guests, and the production definitely made him come off like that as well. So Keith really didn't do himself any favor. So they kind of fit, sorry, he kind of fits the stereotype in more than one way, unfortunately. But luckily, he wasn't around long enough for them to exploit it any longer. And even despite that, I remember they portrayed him as overtly flirtatious, especially in the beginning. So he was seen as an oversexual black man, someone who comes off as aggressive and very religious.
There really isn't much to discuss about Lowan. I think most of his portrayal involved him filling archetypes that gay men tend to have on Big Brother over archetypes that black men tend to have on the show. Of course, he's just generally remembered for being a fool to send himself home, but that's it.
So this is 2024, me. Uh, I do remember Lawan getting along with Keith during the 1 week that Keith was in the house. So there were two black men who got along very well and were aligned with one another. From what I remembered, he and Clea were okay, though they weren't the closest, despite them actually being partners. So there's a lot of black coalition there with him. So I did find that to be very interesting.
So we're going to move on to Kalia, and before the cookout, she was the last black woman who did really well in the competition of Big Brother. The veterans mansplained to Kalia a lot, especially during the week 3 mess that happened, like she was the main one who was behind the plan to save Dominic and to get rid of Jeff, when that wasn't even the case. Seeing Brendan mainly talk to her and demean her like she was stupid, which is a recurring theme with how people deal with black women in the house, really made me uncomfortable during their exchange. So the entire house saw her as a Daniel minion throughout the entire season, like she was not able to make her own moves for herself. It just so happened to have aligned with what Danielle wanted as well, since most of the house was against the both of them. Even people like Jordan had the nerve to say this and demean her when she literally made a move on her own HOH against Cassie that Jordan didn't even want to do. No matter what Kalia did, she never got the credit for it, and even in the jury roundtable, Shelly and the others were demeaning everything she did, and it was just very saddening to watch.
So this is 2024, me with some additional commentary. So, just from my recollection and from my recent rewatch, which I did after I uploaded this video in 2022, I did notice that Kalia and Keith really do not gel well with one another, and despite being partners with Lawan, she never really got that close with him, so it seemed like she didn't really get along with the Black House guests on the season, which is very interesting. The main thing that I do want to discuss is her commentary during Big Brother 24, where Taylor was obviously not being treated well, and the amount of sympathy that Taylor got from the fan base. Kalia mentioned that she herself didn't get the same amount of sympathy when this stuff was happening towards her on Big Brother 13, where Evil Dick was literally harassing her on social media, making fun of her weight and her shaving and all of that, and a lot of the other house guests making fun of her for this as well, where Cassie made a bunch of comments about her being the overweight black woman, kind of compared her to Oprah as well, which was yikes, and a lot of those microaggressions as well. And what she was getting at is that people only feel sorry for black women who are desirable. And honestly, Cleo was not lying at all. There's a lot of gaslighting that people said about how Jordan is 6'10". Yes, it did, and there was literally hashtags underneath the episodes at around this point in time, and Twitter was definitely popping in 2011. And it really caused for a discussion to be had where a lot of fans didn't want to admit that they only feel sorry for a certain subsection of Black women that are either desirable or meeker personalities or a combination of both. And she didn't fit that, which is why Kalia didn't get that same sort of rhetoric.
So we're going to move on to Jodie, and of course, she was only there for a day. But the fact that she was only there for a day brings an interesting discussion. She was not chosen by any of the coaches and was forced to be on Dan's team. So the coaches didn't choose her because she was older, she wasn't bone thin and black, or whether those weren't the outright reasons, they definitely played a factor into why they didn't choose her. When they lost, Dan of course evicted Jodie out of all of them. Clearly, her being an older black woman played a part in her day one eviction. So Howard is next, and oh my gosh. The first thing that I do remember is that they pushed his religion heavily on the show from my recollection, which is just a continuous trend at this point in Big Brother history with their black house guests. There were a lot of racist comments that were made in his presence in the house, and then there was the Pillgate incident that he witnessed. We saw the comments he and Candace made about it, and during it, you see that he's telling her to give up the bed, and I saw this as him wanting her to be the quote unquote agreeable black person just to keep the peace, and she's tired of it. So, as the weeks went on, the racist comments continued, and he was essentially forced in a duo with Candace. As they were seen as outcasts and isolated, essentially, people made fun of the way he spoke a lot, and they were essentially outcasted. People making fun of the way he spoke is generally something that always happens with black people, and it was a way of them insinuating that he was uneducated and ignorant, and the editors would also make fun of the way he spoke. And then there was the element where people saw him as some sort of predator due to some alleged comments he may or may not have made to Amanda, who was obsessed with targeting him at this point.
2024 me appearing here. From my recollection, Howard and Candace weren't even close like that in the beginning of the season, but due to the racial dynamics of the season, it kind of forced them to kind of cling on to one another because they really had no one else. And you also had other people of color like Helen deciding to downplay what was going on in the house so she could navigate her way, and she tossed them under the bus to do so. So that definitely adds another layer to his experience on Big Brother as well. And it kind of explains some of the dynamics between he and Candace, where they handled things very differently, where she would just confront the issue head on, where he would kind of just lay back and he was way too optimistic. So even those two weren't really compatible regarding their strategies, but they're essentially forced together, which doesn't yield the best results.
I just remember the cast not really taking her seriously whatsoever and saw her as expendable. It does not help that her religion was made as a joke in the edit, and she was clearly cast to be the black religious girl, and they also used her to push sassy diary rooms, though Jocasta was not sassy or stereotypical in that lens throughout the house whatsoever. So we are going to talk about Devon in her first two seasons, and of course I'm going to split them both up. So, in Big Brother 17, a lot of the cast talked about her being a mother and how she should not have left her kid to be in the house, though her family was fine with it, so I don't know why any of them cared. It clearly was something they used to attack her. I remember during her very first argument where she was walking around the house and Clay, Shelly, and Jeff thought it was very suspicious, though it is something that everyone in the house does in past seasons, in future seasons, and in this season. They clearly think Devon is up to no good and can't be trusted. Why do they think that she can't be trusted? Is it because she's black? Like, why? Her walking around and minding her own business isn't scary or untrustworthy, which is something that black people consistently have to deal with in everyday life. This led to the fight with Clay, and she ends up crying because she knows how this is going to come across. Also, for some reason, Audrey's shadiness as a game player were forgiven by the entire cast, actually, no, not the entire cast, but one side of the house. But Devon was held to task and seen as the leader of an alliance, which wasn't even the case, and they acted like she didn't deserve her retribution. Even when she was on the block, her own allies didn't really fight for her like that and thought that she was kind of worthless in that way, so she wasn't protected like almost everyone else in the house was protected, so she was seen as expendable. So moving on to her journey in Big Brother 18. When she was assaulted by Frank, most of the house guests didn't even reprimand him and claimed that she was overreacting to the situation. This was even how a lot of fans reacted to it. She just recently stated a few days ago that production apparently didn't give him a warning or a punishment, and the diary room that we saw on the episode about this matter, she thought was an off-table venting session that the house guests go through. So the fact is that most of the house guests didn't think that she was worth protecting as a black woman, or that she was too tough enough to handle it on her own, or she was overreacting to it. Black trauma is always seen as something that isn't taken seriously amongst many others, and it's sad that even production lent into this. And of course, we had people like Nicole and Corey, but mainly Nicole, who continuously called her scary, intimidating, untrustworthy, so on and so forth. And the fact that the house felt the need to backdoor her for some reason, despite her very poor competition results, was ridiculous in my opinion.
Before I move on from 18 to 22, I also want to talk about her interactions with Jose. Obviously, he felt some kinship with her because they are both of black descent, and out of the veterans, he actually liked her, and she definitely played this towards her advantage. And I also think her interactions with him partially came or took place in the way that it did because she was obviously booted very early in her first season and she didn't have a chance to make a move. So she thought that screwing over Josiah was her quote unquote big move. So not only did she throw him under the bus to Nicole, but she was so gleeful and happy about it. So she essentially threw him under the bus for not only for Nicole, who would end up turning on her, but for Polly as well, who literally caused her to go home. And this is kind of a pattern that you would see with Devon, where she kind of throws black people under the bus so she can work with white people. And this continues on into her next season, where she did not get along with David at all during the season, due to apparently Kemi telling her and the other black alumni that David is a sellout and is a corn, but you will replace the second O you replace the R in the corn with the second O, if you know what that term is. So she didn't like him based off of that, despite him wanting to work with her, despite him trying his very best to have an allegiance with her. She and Bailey did get along, though if you really look into their backstory, Bailey reached out to Devon after BB20 because she was getting a lot of hate, but Devon ignored Bailey's DMs, but she spoke to racially ambiguous Josh's DMs the season beforehand, who was receiving a lot of hate and he wanted her advice, and she gave him that advice. But that's kind of besides the point. Apparently, Bailey and Devon started working together because Swaggy kind of organized it. So the friendship between Devon and Bailey wasn't genuine to begin with, and Devon was kind of jealous of Bailey's relationships with some of the non-black house guests, which she consistently talked about as well. She also felt like she's being treated differently between the two of them due to colorism, so that adds another layer in their interactions. And if you go back to Big Brother 18, some of the similar dynamics kind of happened between she and Zakia as well. Though there's more layers to that I might get into. Of course, there's the whole Christmas situation where they were nominated at Christmas, approached them very aggressively. Though they weren't allowed to respond, Devon was trying her best to calm down, not react, because she knew that's what the producers and everyone else wanted. But she, of course, had her explosion, and that ended up happening. Yet again, she threw all of the black descended people under the bus, which included Kevin, and she told him that he was mixed and he wasn't black. Where she wasn't wrong there, but just the way she said it just came off harsh. She judged David for not being religious, though ironically, Devon never got a religious edit. And then she was really trying hard to work with Nicole and Danielle, but they, of course, kind of sandbagged her as well, which caused her to lash out after the season and accuse them all of being racist. And then her and Cody started going back and forth due to it, and it was just a mess. Devon also had her final speech where she credited all of the Black House guests that came before her and how Black House guests will win in the future, but it just hasn't happened yet, which supposedly inspired a lot of the people that came after her. So I do give her props for that, but especially during 18 and 22, some of her actions didn't align with her words, especially when it came to some of her interactions with Black people. And hence her and Bailey not getting along today. That was a whole lot. I could do add a lot more commentary, but I just don't feel like it right now, and I don't want to diverge too much.
So we're going to move on to Zakia from the very same season. Her entire relationship with Polly to me seemed like she was just supposed to be pretty and none of her opinions were supposed to matter. Everyone else saw her as extremely expendable, and she was also harassed by Frank. But that wasn't in the episode. Nicole pulled off the same BS that she did with Devon about Zakia being scary and intimidating, even when Zakia did not fit any of those traits and she did nothing to be seen as scary or intimidating or untrustworthy. So we are going to move on to Dominique from Big Brother 19. Her eviction week is still one of the oddest things that I have ever witnessed on the show. Everyone turned on her so quickly, despite her being allies with a majority of them, and they started acting like she was crazy, made fun of her religion, and claimed that she talked in riddles and couldn't communicate at all, despite her being very well spoken. And of course, there was the blackface scandal that production had to shut down. And if production didn't shut down, they would have continued hazing, harassing, and taunting her, with that being one of the tactics. Of course, several people confronted her in the season and also alienated her like she was an outcast who didn't deserve retribution or comfort. So, Swaggy is next. For some reason, production allowed him to wear Swaggy C shirts in the house, which made him come off as obnoxious to many of the house guests, and he was portrayed as being a loudmouth on the show, though he was very calm and introverted in the house from what was shown on the live feeds. So his portrayal in real life and his portrayal on the show were two completely different things. And the fact that they actually allowed him to call himself Swaggy C is just very weird. Almost like they wanted him to be this obnoxious, boisterous black man that he just generally wasn't. So, for some reason, Tyler was threatened by Swaggy, despite them butting over their deceased fathers and Swaggy telling him everything about his game to earn some sort of loyalty and trust there. And then there's a situation where Winston tried to act like Swaggy was scary and intimidating during their one tiff, even though Winston was the one to start it to begin with. Caitlyn would also say a bunch of stuff about how he was scary and intimidating to justify targeting him, though he had done nothing but treat her with kindness and respect in the house up to that point. So she clearly used microaggressions to justify her stabbing him in the back. So we are going to move on to Bailey from Big Brother 20. Of course, there's that black skin controversy with Rachel and Angela that took place and production gave them a warning about. Personally, the main thing that I remember pertaining to her in the season is that Angela, as the HOH, went out of her way to tell Bailey that she wanted her to be the first black winner of Big Brother, while Angela had already planned to send Bailey home that week. Just very unnecessary and mean gaslighting.
So this is 2024 me talking. I do remember in one of the Big Brother 20 episodes where she talked about being one of the only, if not the only, black person in a predominantly white school growing up, and she grew up for middle class, so that was a struggle since she was always made fun of and she had to find ways to fit in. And I do think she kind of infiltrated or used some of that on her Big Brother seasons, where she was initially closer to the White House guests for the first week that wasn't on the feed, and she maintained good relationships with them for the most part. But obviously, once she got closer to Spiky C, things started to change quite a bit. And then in Big Brother 22, we saw this as well, where she was going to be a part of what would become the Committee Alliance, which Memphis suggested her being a part of it. But Danielle and Nicole, I think it was more Danielle, shut it down because Bailey is associated with Devon, and that's an issue in itself, because why are you associating one black person with another black person being disqualifier for anything. And they're always kind of just grouped together, despite them being very different personalities. And I do, like I mentioned earlier, I do think Bailey and Devon getting close in the season was very circumstantial due to how Devon ignored her for the prior two seasons when Bailey was reaching out, and she continued ignoring her after the season ended. I do feel like Devon was jealous that Bailey was getting on along with a lot of the other house guests, and she made that commentary known a lot. Of course, there was her final week of the season where she was nominated with Devon, where there was a lot of ickiness, especially from Christmas's end. And then I remember watching Danielle and Tyler gaslight her completely, where she was completely in the right. And Bailey knew that she couldn't blow up like she did on Big Brother 20. And she was actually a lot calmer in the season. And I do give her a lot of credit pertaining that. I remember Devon saying that she felt like Bailey got better treatment because while Bailey isn't light skinned, she is lighter than Devon. And I don't recall Devon really mentioning Bailey's hair texture, but she does benefit from texturism as well. So those are just some of the differences between the two of them. And I do feel like Bailey tried her best to agree with everything Devon said on her season because she really wanted that Black sisterhood thing. But it just didn't really work out well in reality.
So, next on the chronological list is David. So, he was one of the four that was immediately outcasted to play in the safety comp with the older man, the black woman, and a plus size Hispanic woman because he was seen as untrustworthy by Jackson for literally no reason. As soon as David came back into the house, due to the camp comeback twist, the Majority Alliance compared him to a jailbird, a sexual predator, claimed that this isn't BET in reference to him, claiming that he essentially didn't belong in CBS or other areas where they acclimated, essentially, and a bunch of other disgusting racist microaggressions. And this was before David could even get a chance to properly introduce himself to the house guests. Remember, up until this point, he was only in the house for a few hours, where he was essentially forced to fight to compete to stay in the house. And when he came back in the house for this twist, it hadn't even been an hour before people like Jack, Jackson, Holly, so on and so forth just rambled with their racist microaggressions. So in All Stars, the all-white alliance of the committee formed, which he of course was not included in, partially because Memphis was obsessed with disliking David, which some in the house felt like was aggressive, especially with how he would treat David and how he would kind of physically like tap him at certain points of time. Devon, of course, falsely accused David of being an Uncle Tom because she was lied to about the Ian vote, and he tried his very best to not flip out over it, since it was an agonizing situation for him, and he didn't want to come off a certain way. I am also going to mention that the fact that they even put him on All Stars to begin with was a clear sign that they used him as a token black male, especially because black men did really, really poorly for the last decade before All Stars even happened, and he was from the most recent season. So they essentially used him as a token black man casting spot.
So, 2024, me appearing here. Another comment that I want to add is that I think in Big Brother 22, he tried so hard to work with all of the black descended people on the season because he knew about the bad reputation that he had, not only amongst the fan base, but amongst the black alumni for being a sellout and an anti-black person due to him not liking Kemi, despite her having a fair share of issues that I'm going to get into very soon, and being very close with Kat, who's a very problematic person in general. So he kind of had to overcompensate his blackness as well while dealing with a lot of trauma due to his experience regarding Big Brother 21 and the postseason. And I remember he kind of had to deal with the realization that the Jacks are racist, and that was definitely something to watch as well.
So we're going to move on to Kemi from Big Brother 21, and despite being a competitor for 2 weeks and being in the house for about 3.5 weeks, she received some of the worst treatment in the house. Do I even need to go into the details about this? I remember a lot of the cast accusing her of stealing clothes, mainly Catherine, despite Kemi never doing that. People like Christine claiming that Kemi is a bad person, she's crazy, so on, so forth, and a bunch of other microaggressions. And the Jacksons also made a lot of aggressive comments about her, which were just unfounded since there was nothing aggressive about her at all, and they never spoke this way about anyone else. There was a lot of physical comments that were made about her as well. Of course, there was Bella who sold Kemi out at every opportunity possible and did her quote unquote hand waving thing or whatever to mock Kemi while they were arguing. And of course, with the Camp comeback twist, she was isolated by the entire house by order of Jack, and it just wasn't a good look. We also had production encouraging her to make sassy hand waving confessionals, which she refused to do, and which is what I believe they convinced Jocasta to do a few seasons prior.
I think another layer to her experience, looking at this from a 2024 point of view now, is that she's ethnically African. I don't know what type of African she is, but she isn't an African American, which, as someone who is of ADOS or a Foundational Black American descent, so that's very interesting. I also found it interesting because she made a lot of commentary on the season that she didn't like David. She didn't really care much for black men in general. So it didn't seem like she was the most pro black person in general. But she was the one who spread so much rhetoric about David being anti black, where it seemed like they didn't like one another just due to their incompatible personalities, not due to their race. And I know she talked about getting a nose job, so it seemed like she didn't like some of her Afrocentric features as well. So that adds another layer to her. Now we're getting into the current diversity era of Big Brother, with the person that I'm discussing here is Aza from Big Brother 23. Obviously, as we all know, the Cookout is known as the most successful alliance ever, and Big Brother 23 is known primarily for the Cookout, which is an alliance of six black descended people getting together and making a secret alliance so they could get to the final six, so the first person of black descent could win Big Brother for the first time. That was the ultimate goal. But within that group of people, there are many different types of people. With the women, Asa is the only unambiguous, darker skinned black woman on the cast and in the group, and it caused for her to have a different experience compared to light skinned black woman Tiffany and mixed race Dougla Hannah, where people automatically saw Asa as more aggressive, or at least that's what people like Brent was saying during the first few weeks, despite her literally being the exact opposite and doing absolutely nothing. Asa did benefit from the Kaka Alliance and not really having to do much of everything, where she kind of had a defeatist attitude at times and she needed to recharge. So she kind of just remained by herself for a while compared to the others who are more active in the strategy elements. I also think her being Cameroonian and an African, not an African American, caused her to have a different perspective on things. She had a different culture, and there's a bit of a clash there as well. She obviously clashed with Tiffany throughout the season. She wasn't the closest to Hannah for the first part of the season either, but she was able to make it to the finale night, and I do think a lot of the fans vitriol for her is was partially due to her being the dark skinned, unambiguous black woman, and her also being African. And it caused for a lot of discussion about diaspora wars as well, which is something that hadn't need to be discussed or never really came up in Big Brother because most of the black people on Big Brother are African Americans, and it's rare for there to be a black Caribbean or black African on the show. But with Asa's introduction, some of those conversations needed to be had, and you definitely saw that with the fan base throughout the season. The next person that I am discussing on here is Derek F. from Big Brother 23. And with him, I don't know if I have a whole lot to say about him because I don't know if his experience was mainly affected by his black identity or his other identities. And by that, I'm referring to either his gay identity or his identity as an overweight man. And this is kind of an area where intersectionality comes from because for certain things, you don't know if it's due to one thing, more than one thing, or that other thing as well. Derek F was portrayed as someone who is very gluttonous and lazy, and that was why he did so poorly in the competitions and why he essentially coasted throughout the season. Obviously, him being black caused him to be in the Black Diasporic or Black Descendant Alliance, where he went to the end due to that, where he would have been voted out most likely earlier had he not been black. So you can't ignore his like identity. But at the same time, I do think that him being overweight caused him to be seen as very unthreatening and lazy as well. But his gay identity also caused him to feel justified in treating a lot of the women in the house the way that he treated them. So he was kind of seen as sassy, very flamboyant, and kind of comedic, but not in like a good way, but in like, a bad way as well. But I think with him, unlike the others, actually no, with him he had three identities that kind of interweaved, came in and came out, but they all affected his experience. But I think the other two had more effect on his behavior and other things where his black identity put him into this good position throughout the season, if that all makes sense. So, the final person in the season, at least with this subgroup that I am going to be referring to, is Xavier from Big Brother 23, and he's obviously the winner, where it honestly seemed very preordained that he was going to win. And I made a video where I talked about the dynamics and the nuances of the cookout, where they talked about having the quote unquote right winner and the quote unquote right representative. And of course, that went to a black man in Xavier, who is more than fine in white spaces. So, with Xavier, he talked about how his former stepfamily, his father was married to his white wife, who was Xavier's stepmom, and obviously she had her own family. I remember Xavier telling everyone that he was half white due to this, and he would kind of claim them as like his family or his white side, and he was an Oreo due to this, and he was clearly doing this so he could impress Christian and Alyssa, and which is very, very, very weird. He talked about his love for a white woman, and he would make all these disparaging jokes about black people to non-black people, so he could kind of make himself be seen as the quote-unquote safe black person. And he's obviously a lawyer where he has to present himself in the best way. And I think because of that, Xavier was very keen on his image and how he portrayed himself. So he acted like the quote unquote good black man, essentially. And he's admitted to this in the in the years since. And I didn't really like it because one, you're teaching black people that they have to appeal to white people in order to find success or to be themselves. And two, it kind of reminded me of a lot of the civil rights leaders back in the day where they fought for black freedom and black rights so they could really get with white women. And them getting with white women isn't the problem, but it's using black people and black women to do that and to kind of disparage your own race to do that. And I think that's why a lot of people kind of felt a way about Xavier and kind of how he wanted to monitor who was the right type of black person. But in general, Xavier really didn't want to work with the cookout, but he felt like that was his only path to win. And he was in support of the movement. So I do feel like he kind of clashed there. And it really did hurt him to have to cut the allies that he was closer to, i.e., a Christian and an Alyssa. But the dynamics of the cookout worked in his favor. And honestly, I didn't even realize that the final three of the cookout and of the season were the three darkest skinned, monoracial, and ambiguous black people. And I wonder if they did that intentionally. So, yeah.
Of course, he was grouped in with the so called non existent POC group that Kyle came up with in his head and told the others about, but it seemed like the White House guests were fine with Terrence since he was the least threatening and planned to take him further along to the end. Terrence would make a lot of assumptions that Taylor and Monty were not black because they had different experiences than him, especially economically, and didn't have the same sort of struggle relating to their economic journeys or due to their experience with white people. What was interesting with Terrence is that he was fine with keeping Kyle in the house and wanted Kyle to quote unquote use this as a learning experience, so he wanted to keep Kyle in the house. But he never showed this grace to any of the other black or POC house guests.
One thing that I did notice with Terrence is that he kept his foot on Michael and Brittany's necks for the rest of the season due to them weaponizing the race scandal, though he didn't give that same energy to Kyle, who actually did it. I do appreciate that he didn't let those two off the hook since what they did were just as bad, and a few of the others forgot about that. I remember people were calling him anti black for not liking Taylor, though he got along with Amira and Jasmine fine, but that could cause for another argument regarding colorism, featureism, texturism, and liking mixed race people or black people. That's you can really go many different ways with that. But Terrence was definitely seen as the ridiculous, over the top, grumpy black man. That was kind of his portrayal throughout the season.
So during the first week, Daniel went to Monty to validate targeting Taylor because Daniel didn't want to catch flack for nominating a black woman and putting a black woman beside a black man, thinking that if a black man approved this, then Daniel would be off the clear. And because Monty was a black man, which Monty would go on and on about during the first week, like he's the standard of blackness and for blackness and the morality of black people, like he's the figurehead for black people, he would talk about how Taylor is a bad representation for black women, so on and so forth. It's even disgusting now that they're in a showman and in a relationship. I'm sure that's going to work out well in real life. But that's a whole nother topic. So, soon after the leftovers were formed, Kyle became paranoid. During Monty's HOH, Kyle started calling Monty and Joseph arrogant, despite neither of them displaying any actions of that trait. A few days later, Kyle starts telling his white allies in the leftovers that the POC in his alliance will join the other POCs in the house to make a cookout alliance, completely missing the point that the cookout was about black people, not people of color, and called Monty as well as the other POC allies as loud, strong personalities, would state that he felt jumped by them, accused them of being aggressive, and a bunch of other microaggressions. Michael and Brittany also tried to push the narrative that Monty made women uncomfortable because they wanted to target him and didn't have any game reason to target him. So they tried doing that as well. And of course, he and Terrence didn't handle it well when Kyle's revelation was revealed to the house by Michael and Brittany, and they were both very angry with the two of them for using race for convenient gameplay.
Okay, so 2024, me appearing here. I do remember a lot of discourse about him feeling sorry for the white Hispanic in Paloma, but not giving that same grace to Taylor. And of course, he and Taylor ended up having that colorism conversation, which he somewhat got, but then he also mentioned that he has family members of every different color, so a part of him really didn't understand that as well. And I did notice that he tried to make himself but appear biracial because his mother is, no, I think she's Puerto Rican, not even Dominican. When, as we all know, Dominican and Puerto Rican are not racist. And just from looking at his parents, they are clearly both black. So he's a black person of two different ethnicities. But I feel like I've said this beforehand, anyways.
So, of course, entering Big Brother 24 and seeing how Taylor is being treated, it's a conglomeration and an amalgamation of all the ways all of these other women have been treated over the last 21 years, and nothing's really changed. And it's even worse because you have a lot of the Black House guests going with this narrative because they don't want to be seen as another cookout, especially in the season after the cookout thrived. It's all just very uncomfortable to watch. And them going to Monte and using him as the quote unquote token black person is just really effed up.
Obviously, being in the house with two mixed race women being the only other black representation and them feeling superior to you, partially due to the isms, was obviously a very uncomfortable position to be in. In addition to the two black men weaponizing their blackness to deter you, to claim that you aren't black enough, where Monty told non black people, he gave them the highlights to mistreat her based on his blackness being superior to hers, and Terrence consistently saying that she isn't black due to her economic status or she doesn't have the black experience, which is problematic in itself because Terrence sees blackness as consistent struggle and nothing else, when black is a race based off of phenotype and lineage. I will say that I do feel like Taylor got a lot of sympathy from the fan base, especially due to her being a pretty black woman and benefiting from pretty privilege. Where if she wasn't seen as conventionally attractive or if she was more overweight, I don't think a lot of the fan base would have cared as much. So I do agree with Kalia's talking points in that regard. Obviously, Taylor was the docile black woman who was a lot more timid, and she didn't really defend herself in any ways throughout the season. But it did work out for her, not only because she won, but she was shown that she was the resilient black woman who is very nice, who can change people's perception of her, and she's non threatening. So that's kind of how she navigated through the game. There was a talking point of her getting with Monty during the last 2 weeks of the season, and people claiming that she used her womanly woes to make it safe, and that's kind of a problematic narrative as well. One issue that I did have with her is during the Cal situation where she did mention where Cal went wrong, though she was very soft on him as well. But when it came to Michael and Brittany's role in it, she consistently defended them, even though they weaponized racism for gameplay purposes. She didn't want to see it. She ignored whenever Monty and Terrence brought it up. And I was like, she refused to see the real nuance of Michael and Brittany's position in the situation because they were her friends. So it seemed like she kind of overlooked certain things based off of who she liked. Though she held Monty and Terrence to the fire the most post season, though I do think a part of that was because she expected more from two black men compared to two non black people. But it was very picky, juicy based off of what was convened. And another thing that I noticed about her is she consistently mentioned person of color, person of color, person of color, ignoring the fact that a decent amount of person of color or people of color identify as white. They play an equal part of anti-blackness, and in general, they have very different experiences from black people. And notice she tends to have done that with Joseph, or in regard to Joseph. So it just kind of shows to me that she kind of lets her personal relationships kind of warp her viewpoint when it comes to certain things. Okay, so I literally forgot Kirsten. I did a few of the Big Brother 25 people before I recorded her. And the only thing that I could somewhat surmise is the fact that it really was Jared, Suri, and Phyllis who kind of pushed for her downfall, where she did a bit too much during the first few hours of the season. And Sweet and Jared were obviously trying to save him as well. And Felicia didn't really like Kirsten. I felt that she was not a good role model or whatever, and I'm saying that very politely. So there's that dissension there, and I know that when Kirsten left the house, she felt the most betrayed by them, and she was angry at them. So I'm thinking that she was expecting some sort of black loyalty that really wasn't there, though a lot of the Black House guests this season didn't care about any of that. So on to Big Brother 25 is Jared, and he is an interesting one to me because Jared does not give a single F about political correctness, identity politics, or being the quote unquote good black person. And a part of him kind of reminds me of Marvin in the fact that he is so unapologetically himself, but that comes with a lot of problematic elements as well, compared to a lot of the Black House guests who are always trying to filter themselves and want to be seen as the quote unquote good Black person. But I also feel like a lot of this regarding Jared came from his privilege due to the fact that he had his mother, who is a reality TV veteran in the house, and her essentially doing a lot of the work to make things easier for him. Of course, people called him out for his supposed misogyny and a lot of his blatant comments. But I do, a part of me does feel like a lot of the fan base calling him out regarding his antics and his aggressive approach was due to him being black, where if someone of a different race acted the same way, I don't think they would have cared that much. Especially when his main argument was with a man. Jared really wasn't into the quote unquote pro black alliance that there was talk about forming. He really wasn't about that. And a part of him kind of wanted to sabotage that as well because he was the only guy in the alliance and he kind of felt like he was forced to work with his mother. I also have to note that he was in the first interracial showmance that didn't involve a white person. So I found that to be pretty interesting as well. But in general, there's not a whole lot to say about Jared here. Though he is someone that I don't think would have been cast without his mother due to how they in general cast black men as of late in the recent years and in this current era. Now we are moving on to who really didn't do much in the season and didn't get much camera time. And while that could kind of just be a discussion on their own, where they felt like she wasn't easy to stereotype or put into a box, they just decided not to edit her. You could make that argument, but I do think a lot of it had to do with how she played the game. So obviously she was loyal to the Bye Bye Bitches, and she was on that side of the house. And there was also another group that she, Sari, Felicia and kind of Gerard had as well, where she was expecting them to work as kind of like a cookout. And she wanted to replicate the cookout, though she didn't realize that the fields didn't agree with that at all, and it was really a fake alliance on their point of view. And because she wanted to replicate the cookout so much, she rejected the olive branches that were extended to her from the other side of the house with people like Corey, America, and some of the others as well. So she really limited herself towards an alliance or for an ideology that wasn't even present at all, and it really screwed up her gameplay. And it screwed it up even more because Suri felt like Nicole turned on her son. Obviously, Nicole didn't know it was her son at the time. And when she was nominated against Felicia, they decided to send her home due to how inflexible she was. So, Nicole is kind of an example of how being too pro black can kind of be a deterrent on the show, as even in this diversity era. Honestly, especially during this diversity era, because she saw it work 2 seasons earlier, and then she saw another Black Final 2 the season prior this, and it just didn't work out for her. So that's kind of just her story. So now we are moving on to Suri, and She's very interesting in this discussion. I'm pretty sure when she saw the cast, she kind of knew that it was advantageous for her, where they cast four other unambiguous monoracial black people, one of them including her son, and it was kind of expected for all of them to work together, and Suri definitely used that towards her advantage. But when the likes of Nicole and Felicia, but especially Nicole, was trying to push another cookout situation, she was like, hell no, absolutely not. No cookout whatsoever. Nada, 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 nada. And she really just wasn't here for it. And it caused me to think back to her Survivor seasons where she really didn't work with many black people either. But I'm thinking about it, there really weren't any of them, with the exception of Game Changers, where she and Michaela did bond due to being the two only black women on the show. And her closest ally, obviously outside of her son, were Izzy and Matt, two white people. And everyone else was very expendable to her. So obviously, when Izzy left, she was kind of checked out. She really didn't care what happened to Felicia and McCall. And then once all the other allies left, she was kind of forced to stick it with Felicia. And that was an issue because they were kind of incompatible strategically and personality wise. And people kind of just saw them as the two funny older black women. So there was that. And then the look of it wasn't a good look when the other two kind of isolating and trashing these two older black women at the final five. It really was just lame. But yeah, it kind of just shows that Suri would do anything that she can to make it to the end. She really didn't care about racial lines this season, and I think a part of that is because she didn't want to be limited due to that, and she already knew that's what people would assume. And I also think her protecting her son was also the bigger priority. And once Izzy was gone, no one once Izzy and Gerald were gone, she really just didn't care. So I think that's her experience. But when you look at her reality TV career, she had to navigate through a bunch of white people, and she didn't really have many people who looked like her in the game. So I think she was used to kind of just being free in that element. So while she saw that there being four other black people on this season helpful to her, I think a part of her also felt limited due to it, based on her prior reality TV experiences where she didn't have to deal with that. So the final person in this season is Felicia. And honestly, I did not like her at first. She kind of reminded me of those older black women who like to throw shade at a lot of the younger black women because they are able to do certain things that they weren't allowed to do when they were younger, or they were more free, or things just changed a lot. And you saw that a lot with her rhetoric towards Kirsten, where she definitely slut shamed her and all of that, and kind of insinuating that she was a bad role model for black women and all that other just junk. But after she left, she was very all about working with Suri, working with Jared, working with Mikal, and she was definitely more supportive of the black people working together and sticking together throughout the season. At the same time, you can definitely tell that she was cast to be the sassy black woman, and they definitely got their content with her there, as she definitely had her fair share of arguments, she had her fair share of one-liners that weren't very funny, and she had the big personality as well. Obviously, I talked about how in the final five round, she and Suri were isolated from the other house guests who were not black, and the trash talking that happened just wasn't a good look, and that continued into the final four, where it was just her as well. At the same time, I kind of feel like it wasn't her race, but it was mainly her age that caused Felicia to do whatever she wanted and say whatever she wanted to say, and people kind of just accepted it based off her age. And I think it's due to that more than her race. You can tell that she and Suri were kind of forced to stick together after a while because they really didn't have anything in common. But because they are the only one of their group left, and they're both older black women, where all the other black people on the season were a generation or two younger than them. It kind of forced this supposed bond between them that might not have been the most genuine, anyways. Okay, so we are finally at Big Brother 26, and the first person that I am referring to is Core. Obviously, the interesting about her is that she migrated from London. So she was born in London and migrated to the US sometime in her childhood. And I think even with her being from London, I think she is of West African descent. Like, she has direct relatives from Africa. It might be Nigeria, it might be somewhere else in West Africa, but that's her lineage. So when it comes to her identity, she's an African Brit, which is different from being a Black American, ADOS, traditional Black American, or even a Black Caribbean. So I think that has her seeing things very differently. The one thing about T Core is that she consistently mentioned people of color, people of color, people of color. She throw black in there sometimes, but she mainly talked about people of color, people of color, people of color. And that is because her two main allies were people who were of Asian, they're of Asian or Pacific Islander descent. That's why she always said people of color, people of color, people of color. So she would have conversations with Chelsea, Cedric, and Cameron about how the black people, though they're already of black descent, but I'm gonna get there when I get there, need to stick together. We all need to work together. But ultimately, when it came to be Rubina and Cedric on the block, all of her pro-black, pro-black, pro-black stuff went out of the way, and she decided to vote out mixed race Cedric over Filipino Asian Rubina. I remember there was a lot of discourse about this online when it happened because people kind of called her out for kind of grifting being pro-black due to this. But despite voting out Cedric, she still had this bond with Chelsea. She always protected her because Chelsea's a black woman. That was her rhetoric. Though she never gave that same courtesy or energy towards Cameron, where she nominated him when she was the age of 8 and she would have been fine with him going home. So people found that selectiveness to be very annoying as well. And it seemed like she, and to a lesser extent, Chemo and Rubina, kind of weaponized the person of color talk whenever it was convenient for them, and a lot of people just did not like that at all. And I think with T-Core, she used that as a reference because I think she only watched Big Brother 23 onwards, where obviously there's a lot of discourse about black people working together, PLC, yada yada yada, because she only watched the diversity era season. So I think she used that as a talking point, and that's really all I have to say. So the final person in this group is Cameron from Big Brother 26, and I cannot believe that this section is this long, but I guess it shows that most of the people of black descent that are cast on the show are unambiguous, monoracial black people. So from the beginning, it was clear that Cameron wasn't going to be a problematic black house guest, i.e., someone who kind of uses the quote unquote good black person to disparage other black people that they don't deem to be worthy, someone who pretends to be pro black but spews anti black rhetoric, or someone who isn't misogynistic or just has a foul personality. But at the same time, he was kind of made fun for being this very chill, very relaxed person, and they kind of I saw stuff about him kind of being like the lazy black man who was carried by the tough, hardworking black woman. I saw a lot of that narrative play out, especially regarding his interactions with Chelsea throughout the season, especially from a gameplay point of view. And then there are other people who are triggered by him because Chelsea is the black woman who had a crush on Cameron, but Cameron was innocently flirting with Mackenzie and Leah throughout the season, so a lot of people didn't like him for flirting with white women, though he and Chelsea supposedly agreed that the feelings were mutual off feeds. I don't know about all of that, but I saw a lot of this rhetoric, and I think it reminded them of Xavier and to a lesser extent Monty. But I remember a lot of the conversation was about him being the lazy black man, and it seemed like people kind of eased up on him when it comes to some of the rhetoric throughout the season, but he was made fun of due to not being able to win competitions. And I think because he's a very fit black man, it's expected of him to be a huge comp beast. And even the ones who don't win have that stigma on them. So for Cameron to essentially be carried due to him not being able to win was very interesting. I know he talked on the feed about how he was made fun of by people because he was dark skinned, so that means that he was a victim and a recipient of colorism that he kind of had to deal with. I do find it interesting that despite Cameron being a very nice, chill, relaxed guy, he wasn't quote unquote one of the best black representatives regarding black men ever. And people still clowned him. And I have a few reasons for that. And I do think a part of that is due to him being an ambiguous black man, and a lot of the social media verse in general just don't like black men. They want to villainize them for anything they do, even if they aren't problematic. But yeah, that's all I have to say for this one. So, this next subgroup of people, which really isn't a long list, but these are for the people who obviously have ties to blackness, but it's a bit unclear whether they are monoracial or they are heavily mixed. And these are people who I like to call ambiguous or exoticals. And exotical specifically, it's a movement on YouTube, from what I see, where these are the people who tend to benefit from some of the isms. So that is featureism, so more Eurocentric or non Afrocentric features, colorism, so they have lighter skin, or texturism, which is people who have looser textures that are associated with non-black people. And these are people who tend to benefit from, uh, generally some benefit from more than one of them, but what makes them distinct from mixed people is that you don't tend to know if they are mixed or recently mixed. So people who are multi-generationally mixed, so people who come from several generations of mixed people tend to fall under here, or people who are monoracially black, but they just either have light skin, or they have looser hair, or they have thinner features, but they are black. So they're kind of the in between regarding unambiguous black people and mixed people. And I don't know whether a lot of these people are black or not, or heavily mixed or not. So they are here. Or at least that's the case for a lot of them. I think a prime example of an exotical is someone like Autumn from Big Brother 2, where she has very light skin and she has thinner facial features compared to a lot of black people. And I honestly don't know if she's biracial or not. There's no information out there that I can verify whether she is or not, hence her kind of being in this group. I'm just going to play my old commentary regarding her.
She didn't last long at all. She was the second boot, but there was still a lot of drama that involved her. It was briefly discussed in the episode, but there's a situation where Mike Boogie allegedly asked to sleep with her so she could vote with them to boot Nicole, and when she didn't agree to that, Chilltown essentially harassed her and hazed her, as they also made fun of her eating disorder, and I don't get why they decided to pick on her out of all people. Was it because they felt like she wasn't worth protecting? There was also kind of a lot of slut shaming that was happening in the Big Brother house at the time. And I remember even allies like Hardy and Nicole started bashing her a lot during her elimination week, as she was slut shamed, called emotional, thirsty, and it was just really awkward just watching everyone kind of just isolate and make fun of her. She literally had no one. And you notice throughout Big Brother that there's always this trend of black women not being protected, or the house guest feeling like she shouldn't be protected.
Okay, so this is 2020 for me here. And I just remembered something. During her fight with Mike Boogie, it was mentioned that she was telling people that if black guys were here, she would be getting a lot of attention. And I found this interesting in a few ways. One, I believe she had a boyfriend while she was in the house. And two, we did see her flirt with Hardy, but he really just wasn't taking the bait and he wasn't interested. And of course, with that whole event with Mike Boogie that blew up, clearly her sexualization came to the forefront here. The fact that she feels like she would get more attention if black guys were here, says a few things. One, it just means that she could be more comfortable with black people instead of a bunch of white people in that way. And two, she knows that black men like people who has her phenotype and appearance. The next person in this group, and I'm going on a chronological basis, is Devin from Big Brother 16. I've heard a few people mention that he's biracial, but there's nothing that I could find that confirms that, and he's kind of in the middle ground here. And you could see that there's probably some admixture there based off of some of his features, so he's a beneficiary of featureism, you could argue, that could indicate some admixture, but he comes off as more ambiguous in some ways compared to the monoracial black man, and I don't know if he's mixed race, so I can't really put him there. So here he is.
So with Devin, he made a lot of bad game moves during his HOH, and people were rightfully upset about it. So after Paola and Zach essentially yelled at him, where he didn't say much, though a part of the reason why I think he didn't say much is because he didn't want to be seen as the scary, aggressive black man, and they brought up some personal stuff, he hid in his HOH room for the rest of his duration in the house, and everyone was quote unquote scared of Devin, despite him never losing his anger, especially compared to some of the other house guests in the house. People like Nicole mentioned that they feared for their safety with Devin in the house and pushed that scary narrative on him, and he essentially isolated himself for his final week and a half in the game, to the point where production had to force him to campaign when he was on the block, since there was no footage. So he didn't even feel comfortable.
So the next person on this list is Jose from Big Brother 18. I do know that his ethnicity is Puerto Rican, but as I've stated before, that doesn't say anything about his racial makeup. Obviously, he has black ancestry just from looking at him, but you can also tell that there's probably some admixture there as well, as he is light skinned and he benefits from texturism as he has very loose hair and it's almost wavy, which isn't common amongst black people. He could just very well be monoracially black Puerto Rican, but I do know that on average there's a lot more admixture with people from the Spanish Caribbean due to that being heavily encouraged. And I also heard that he's part Moroccan, so I don't know if that's a rumor or not, but he definitely comes off as a bit more ambiguous looking than a lot of the others. But I don't know how mixed he is, or if he's even mixed race, hence him being here.
With Jose, he essentially started a POC alliance with half of the house, and because Victor was safe, the veterans and the alliance targeted him. I don't think this had anything to do with his race per se, but the fact that he wanted to make a POC alliance definitely brought it into perspective, and he had POCs Zakia and Devon sell him out. And I think this led to why Josiah, who was eventually partnered with Devon in the challenge Final Reckoning, felt some sort of way because he felt like she kind of sold him out and used the race card, essentially.
So the next person that I am placing here is Justin from Big Brother Over the Top. And I only have him here because I discussed him in the last video. So from what I remember, he is a Louisiana Creole, which is an ethnicity, but a vast majority of Louisiana Creoles are heavily mixed with black and white. So they are heavily mixed. From what I can research, I don't think Justin is biracial in the sense of having one black parent and one non-black parent, but it's clear that he is mixed as he has a lot of non-black features via his hair texture, causing him to benefit from texturism, his skin color being extremely light, so he benefits from colorism, and having thinner features, so he benefits from featureism as well.
Of course, a lot of the White House guests made him seem like he was very aggressive, ghetto, and uneducated, and there was a lot of gaslighting pertaining him. There was that awkward situation with Monty. Ugh, I almost forgot there's more than one Monty, where Justin essentially kind of had to like put him in his place, especially since they're all also kind of going against Danielle as well. And the situation was just very. So with Ramses, The only memorable thing about him, in my opinion, was him claiming that he wasn't black in his preseason interviews because he is Dominican. Anyways, he was isolated from the game the entire time, was deemed untrustworthy for very little reason, though there have been white nerds who have gotten leeway despite acting the same way he has, and no one saw him as valuable in the house, where he was a disposable boot in the late pre-jury when Jessica won HOH.
Okay, so it's 2024 me back. And obviously, I have to discuss that preseason thing more because one, why did he bring that up as a fun fact that he wasn't black? Jeff didn't even ask about his racial or ethnic background. Ramses kind of just threw that out there. Is it because one, he knows that when people look at him, they see a black man, that's why he's saying this? Two, he doesn't like blackness or anything associated with blackness. And three, he doesn't know the difference between nationality, ethnicity, and race, where black is a race and Dominican is a nationality and an ethnicity. Most Dominicans are mixed with black and white, and they're a bit more white than black on average. That is true. But there are some black Dominicans. Ultimately, Ramses is here because he benefits from colorism, and he claims that he is a mixed Dominican, or at least that's what I'm getting from this. And it's not even just a Spanish Caribbean thing, because Jose identifies as a black person or an Afro person, where Ramses clearly does not. Maybe it's just a different pathology between Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. I don't really know. So the next person on this list is Josh from Big Brother 19. On my last video, I did not include him here because it's obvious that he's not black, but since his racial identity keeps on coming up, I feel like I have to include him here. Okay. Obviously, Josh is mixed, but he technically isn't biracial because just from looking at his parents, it's obvious that both of them are mixed. His father being darker skinned does not mean he is black, it could just mean that he is mixed with black, but it doesn't mean that he is black. And Josh is Cuban on both sides, where his mother is bordering on white or white passing. Clearly, just looking at his parents, they are very mixed. And looking at Josh, he is mixed too, and he is very racially ambiguous. And he also benefits from colorism because he's extremely pale. He benefits from featureism because he really has like little to no black features, and he benefits from texturism because he has very loose textures, and he's getting all of this from his non-black ancestry as well. There's a situation where I believe his siblings or whatever said the N-word, or they're trying to defend Josh's ancestry, where they said that their grandfather was black and they kept on having to like go deep into the family history to justify this person's black, then that means we are black and we can say and do anything we want when it comes to blackness, and it was just a stretch because when you have to dig into your family history and just from looking at you, we can't tell that you're black because you clearly have other stuff going on. You're not black. You are mixed, and that is okay. Speaking of Josh, literally no one on Big Brother 19 treated him like a black person. He never identified as a black person. They just saw him as a non-black Latino, and that is fair because that's essentially what he is. And when he won Big Brother 19, he was the first Hispanic and the first Latino winner. There was never any black attached to the title of his win, at all. As we all know, Hispanic and Latino ain't no race, so that obviously says nothing about his racial makeup. But even still, the black Latinos always say that they are black and Latino. We've seen this with Monty. Heck, even with Kylan, who has a black parent, says black. That's just what it is. So Josh is just seen as a mixed Hispanic winner, and he was the first Hispanic winner. That was always something that was pushed throughout the season, and no one claimed otherwise for the 4 years after Big Brother 19. Of course, even on the season, he was kind of seen as the buffoon who got loud, rambunctious, volatile, and he was definitely clowned due to that. It wasn't until Big Brother 23 where Josh being black supposedly came up again. And this was because the cookout was thriving as an alliance, and the whole basis of the cookout was the fact that there would be the first black winner. That was their goal. And because they wanted to be the first black winner, it meant that every other winner in the last 22 seasons, which includes Josh, is not black. A bunch of fans started saying, oh, Josh is black, so there's no reason why the cookout should be doing this, despite that never being stated anywhere earlier. Josh got dragged into it. He says that he is an Afro Latino. Well, Afro Latinos are just black people who happen to be Latino. And then he says, but he doesn't identify as a black person because he is mainly Hispanic and because that is associated with African American, where one African American or Black American is an ethnicity tied to people descended from the United States. And going by that definition, some of the cookouts wouldn't even fit Black American on an ethnic point of view because they come from other places that isn't from the United States. Black is a race where anyone who is black from anywhere across the world who has overwhelming amounts of sub-Saharan African DNA and has the phenotype of a black person and the lineage of a black person is black. So black has nothing to do with ethnicity. There are black people all over the world outside the US. So the fact that he doesn't identify as that clearly means that he is not black, and that is okay. And the fact that people only brought this up so they could downplay the cookout just showed that their intentions were not pure, it wasn't good, and that they brought this up 4 years after Josh won Big Brother 19 is just ridiculous. And even on his reality shows, he's never treated as or identified as a black person at all. Even in Cuba, someone like him would not be considered a black person. They would be considered mixed. Because there are legit black people who look black, who have black parents, so on and so forth, and they don't look like Josh. Josh is a mixed race Latino with black descent. But just because you are descended from black people does not mean that you are solely a black person. It's the same way with anyone from another race. But they weaponized this so they could downplay the cookout, and that really pissed me off because it wasn't coming from a genuine place. And clearly, just looking at Josh, you can clearly see that he is racially ambiguous because he is heavily mixed. And black people are not heavily mixed, and that is okay. Where he is from, people have their own racial category, their own racial census data, and they have their own identification. So calling him what he is, mixed, shouldn't be a problem. Alrighty, so we're moving on to Tiffany from Big Teen, and I'm pretty sure she's just a light-skinned black woman. And I remember seeing pictures of her mother, and she's clearly darker, and Tiffany said that her father is black as well. And just from looking at her, the only thing that she would benefit from is colorism because she is a light skinned black woman. Tiffany talked about throughout the season that she felt othered by many black women growing up and in her life due to the fact that she had lighter skin, and they felt like she wasn't a part of the community due to her lighter skin. So she had issues regarding that. And I remember Tiffany also talking about wanting more light skinned black woman representation on the show. And people got in their feelings about this, but Tiffany was clearly referring to a light skinned woman who's not mixed race, but just a light skinned black woman. And there are differences between a light skinned black woman and a mixed person. And most of the light skinned people of the diaspora on the show have been and are mixed race. So Tiffany had that right. Unfortunately, whenever Tiffany would have conflict with Aza, people would accuse her of colorism, and I do think Tiffany said some off remark things that kind of just further lightened the criticisms. So there's that whole discussion online, though I also think a part of their clashes had to do with Azza being African, like Cameroonian, actually, that's the specific nationality and ethnicity, while Tiffany being an ADOS woman. And they are also of different ages, so I think that's where things came into play. But despite that, she came off as rough around the edges to some of her cookout members, and they kind of weaponized that to claim that is why she isn't deserving of being the winner of the season or the quote unquote black representative, which is very problematic in itself. And Tiffany's very proud of being black, and she's talked about it. And I also felt like because she wasn't mixed race, some of the cookout members didn't pedestalize her due to it, and it's really just uncomfortable. But that was Tiffany's experience, and watching her interact with Hannah, who is a mixed race Dougla, and Aza, who is an unambiguous Cameroonian, kind of brought out all of these different layers regarding how Black people interact with one another and how different people of the racial group tend to have different experiences and how those experiences intersect with one another. So, the next person on this list chronologically is Jasmine from Big Brother 24. She's extremely light skinned. She also benefits from featureism as she has thinner features, and she also benefits from texturism as she has still curly but looser hair textures as well. And there was an old video that I saw somewhere where she did claim that she's mixed. So that makes sense. The thing with her is that she isn't biracial. And some people states that because you aren't biracial, it doesn't mean that you are mixed. But I think in Jasmine's case, she is multi-generationally mixed. So her parents are heavily mixed, her grandparents are as well, so on and so forth. So that tends to happen. And I think Jasmine fits that bill. Okay, so I didn't realize that I didn't add Jasmine in the last video because I did it before Big Brother 24 finished, and that was an idiotic decision on my part. So from what I remember, she immediately didn't like Taylor, like from like the first 2 days of the game, and no one even did anything yet, and it was very, very uncomfortable to watch. And she said the nastiest crap. So since it wasn't behavior based, people automatically assumed that it was due to the fact that Taylor is black and Jasmine is very light skinned, who benefited from all of the isms. I also remember a discussion where Jasmine and Amira were talking about, I think Taylor talked about colorism and stuff to Amira, and Amira reported that conversation back to Jasmine, and the two of them were kind of just laughing and making fun of her for it regarding the conversation. So it was just a horrible look, and it seems like she clearly knew about her privilege and reveled in it as well. Jasmine kind of did go back and forth about her being a black woman and a mixed woman, just from what I've seen. I don't know if she started identifying more with being black due to moving to Atlanta or whatever. But there was also, of course, the cow situation where she was accused of being with all of the people of color, despite her trying to get out Monty for like half of the season and her not liking Taylor whatsoever, and them not getting along until her final week in the house. But it definitely seemed like to me, Jasmine kind of knew her privilege within the black community and kind of weaponized it. And she wanted to be the standard, which explains some of her behavior and rhetoric. She was the only darker skinned monoracial black person on the season. The final person in this group is Chelsea from Big Brother 26. Honestly, I don't know if she's just a light skinned black woman or she's multi generationally mixed. Obviously, she is not biracial because I saw her parents and they aren't of different races. And she could very well just be a light skinned black person. But then I saw her brother and he looks heavily mixed. So I really don't know. But in general, I do think she fits the exotical bracket due to her skin color and her hair texture as well. Honestly, I don't really think Chelsea cared much about the racial identification and the identity politics throughout the season, like T-Core, and to a lesser extent, Chemo and Rubina did. But she used their obsession with racial identity politics toward her advantage, since the three of them were loyal to her throughout the entire season due to it and them wanting a POC winner, and that caused her to have them as allies, even when they are going after her allies. Of course, there's the whole thing with everyone of Black descent being grouped together by Angela, but Chelsea really had nothing to do with it, and she was kind of out of the fray with that situation in general. It seemed like she cared more about the whole feminism stuff than the black stuff because she decided to take. No, she mentioned that she would have taken Mackenzie to the end over Cameron had she won the final HOH, and just from the last few weeks, it was very obvious that was where she was going because she was also getting a lot more annoyed with Cameron. There was also the optics of her having a crush on Cameron and then getting very jealous of him flirting around with the white woman on the season, as it just kind of made her look very clingy and desperate. And that element of her and her dynamic with Cameron was there throughout the entire season. She did get along with T-Core during the entire season, and there's no issues with them. So they are an example of how a lighter skinned woman and a darker skinned woman can get along and be very peaceful and friendly towards one another. So I did like that dynamic, which wasn't the case with Big Brother 24. And heck, even Big Brother 23 at times. So the final group are people who are mixed race. This refers to biracial and multiracial people. Most of the people in this category are biracial, but there is at least one who is multiracial. And the people on this list are confirmed to have one non-black parent. Okay, so they have one black parent and one non-black parent, making them mixed race. But as we all know, with casting, they like to one drop mixed people. So that is why they're in this category and they represent blackness. But they are mixed race, either being biracial or multiracial. I just want to get that over and done with.
I'm going to move on to Amanda from Big Brother 4, and honestly, there really isn't much to say here. The only thing that I could really catch was Nathan continuously mentioning that Amanda was untrustworthy as he targeted her, while she did nothing that indicated as such, and she did seem like someone who would be loyal to those who were loyal to her. She didn't do anything that was deemed untrustworthy, sneaky, so on and so forth. The quote unquote untrustworthy word tends to go around on Black House guests for little to no reason, even when it doesn't fit, but it didn't seem like many people took the time to get to know her, and she was immediately outcasted.
2024 me is coming up here to talk about this, and she states in her intro package biracial being half black and half white, hence her being on this category. Apparently, Nathan had some very typical Oklahoma traditional viewpoints, so I am wondering if that might have played into a factor as to why he targeted Amanda here, according to what was said on some of those feed recaps. The next person on the list is Natalie from Big Brother 11, where she is half black and half white Argentinian, hence her being biracial. Okay, so I actively forgot in the last video, and I really don't know why I did that. One, I do think her bond with Chima had to do with the fact that they are both of black descent, and they are the only ones who are of black descent amongst the women on the cast. So I do think that is why those two got uber close from the very beginning of the season. And I liked how much they cared for one another and how much they supported one another. So it was very genuine, and it does show how monoracial and mixed race women can get along. It did seem like Natalie didn't really get along with a lot of the White House guests throughout the season, and it was interesting how the house kind of divided by white people and quote unquote non white people, or non-white people as well. And then there's the coup that happened to her, and she definitely had to kind of climb her way back up into a decent enough position to the second half of the season, where she was in a good position, but obviously the twist ruined it. But then she got to the end where she really wasn't supported. Most of her allies turned on her, and Jordan was rewarded the win, despite Natalie working so much harder and having more influence in the game. So you could see that as a story of a colored woman having to fight so much harder compared to a white woman, has to fight twice as hard to get half the amount of credit, and still might not get rewarded at times. There was also the thing with her supposedly being dirty, and people kept on talking about it, and they found her to be very annoying with a big attitude. And I'm wondering if there was some racial play in there as well, but I don't really know.
So now it's time to discuss Kevin. He was called a racist term by Braden, who assumed he was Latin, hence making a slur in relation to Mexican people, which is problematic in itself because you're assuming someone is something else without knowing the facts, and using a racist term based off of your horrible preconceived notions. But this situation caused him to drift towards the POC majority side of the House, since he felt like people like Jeff didn't stand up for him enough and didn't condemn Braden enough. A lot of people overlooked this situation due to game reasons and was perfectly fine with keeping Braden in the house, despite his racist antics. He would continuously feel uncomfortable around Jeff throughout the rest of the season, and he would talk about this in All Stars, though I don't know if he felt uncomfortable with Jeff due to the racial differences or the differences between their sexuality. So in All Stars, he was told by Davon that him being biracial meant that he wasn't black enough and he felt excluded due to being biracial. He was always on the out in both of his seasons, but I don't know if that was because of an amalgamation between his race and sexuality or just other reasons.
This is 2024 me coming in, and I do remember Kevin talking about how he didn't really fit in either category since he is half Japanese and half Black American. So he didn't really fit in with the Asian people and he didn't fit in with the Black people. And I do think this partially has to do with the fact that Asians are generally very underrepresented, even compared to Black and white biracial people and Asian people. And I think a part of that has to do with a lot of people centering biraciality being half white. So I think that's why they're kind of less visible, mainly the Asians. And Kevin looks very racially ambiguous, and due to that racial ambiguity, he got called things that he wasn't even a part of racially or ethnically, and that isn't something that a lot of black people deal with. Heck, even a lot of biracial people don't deal with that. Like, a lot of the non ambiguous looking ones deal with. The next person on this list is Monet, who is biracial with half white and half black. There really isn't much to say about her overall.
The one thing that I remember of her since she was booted second is I remember the house guests acting like she was so immature, loud, and catty in comparison to the other woman in the house, especially compared to Brittany, who was just as bad, if not worse. I even see a lot of the fans to this date still act like Moni was the devil for doing what she did, but everything Brittany did was excused.
I think that her being the only non white person on the cast, even though she herself is half white, was definitely a huge culture shock, and she probably felt isolated. And yes, Brendan, a white Hispanic, is still white. So Monet technically was the only non white person on the cast. And with that being the case, anything that she did automatically would have stood out a lot more compared to the homogeneously white cast and the cast members within that.
We are moving on to Candace from Big Brother 15, and this is easily the biggest case of racism that black and mixed women have faced in Big Brother history. And honestly, I don't even want to go over all of this, and I probably can't even go over all of it, even if I wanted to. I don't really feel the need to go too deep in this one. Because Candace was a pageant girl and quote unquote didn't speak like a black girl, the house thought she was fake and immediately was put on the out as she was nominated in the first week and wasn't brought into any other alliances. A bunch of racist slurs, microaggressions, and outright macroaggressions were displayed by most of the house guests. Obviously, everyone talks about Bedgate, and they rightfully do talk about that horrible display of actions, where they targeted her bed when she wasn't even the main reason why the group of Gina Marie, Caitlin, Aaron, and Jeremy were upset to begin with. And of course, Amanda using racial slurs against Candace in her final week during the veto competition. Even beyond what was shown, her skin color and being associated with being dirty, as well as her hair, came up, and calling her unhygienic due to it. Her being biracial was used as an attack as they wanted to quote unquote see the quote unquote black side to come out and how she wasn't quote unquote white enough, which Spencer made some comments along those lines as well. She was left out of several alliances, and no one even really came out to defend her throughout the season because it would hurt their game to defend and stop racism. Technically, they did defend racism because they didn't stop it from happening.
I think her situation is unique in the sense that the cast very well knew that she was mixed race and used her mixed race identity to attack her and to be vile towards her, where they knew she wasn't a monoracial black woman, so they had to use different tactics. I already kind of mentioned in House section how the treatment and the racial dynamics of the season kind of forced them to be together and to align, despite them not really having compatible strategies and them not being the closest in the beginning. And it's also another example of how other minorities don't really care about your plight and they will join up with the white people so they can get away from you and so they can benefit from that proximity.
So now we're going to move on to Amber from Big Brother 16. So we have Nicole and Christine claim that she is quote unquote scary and intimidating for little to no reason and immediately dislike her, despite Amber trying to help them out at several points, and she's one of the nicest and least intimidating people to have ever been on Big Brother, but she automatically received those microaggressions that black women are consistently given. People like Zach felt the need to berate her for something that didn't even happen, and Hayden felt comfortable in mentioning how much he wanted to harm her, though she did nothing to either one of them either. Most of the cast thought she was fake because she was timid and well spoken and claimed that she was playing Caleb, knowing that it wasn't the case and that he was delusional. It was like they couldn't believe that a mixed woman could be well spoken or timid or just genuinely nice. There was always so much aggression pertaining how the house guests talked to and about her, but never treated any other woman or any other man like that in the season, and it was like they didn't believe someone could act like her if she was black or biracial. Seeing the other glee they had in isolating and evicting her was just very uncomfortable to watch.
2020 for me, I do think a large part of Amber's experience on the show had to do with the sexualized mulatto trope or vibe that the season, as obviously they all knew that she was mixed race, and many people thought that she was attractive, and they kind of gave her this Jezebel label, claiming that she was using her wiles to manipulate Caleb and to flirt with all the other men. Even Devin threw this accusation against her, and I really do think that if she was fully white, I don't think she would have gotten anywhere near the same amount of smoke or vitriol when it comes to this and her femininity as well.
I'm just going to mention Big Brother over the top, and I remember literally as soon as Danielle walked into the house, most of the girls immediately hated her, and she didn't even do anything. They thought she was stuck up, they thought she was snotty. It was clear that they were very intimidated by this mixed woman who was being friendly at this point, but they refused to give her a chance, and that just, in my opinion, came off like they judged her based off of her race and based off of her being a confident mixed woman.
So we are going to move on to Hannah, who is half Indian and half Black South African, making her, or her mixture is a dougla, which is a term that's commonly used in the Caribbean to describe people who are half Indian and half Black. From what I remember, she grew up in a predominantly white area growing up. She didn't have a whole lot of interaction with black people, if I remember correctly. But I think she also said that Devon's speech kind of inspired her to do the show. So it's clear that she wanted to get more in touch with her black side. Luckily for Hannah, she was on a season that had five other people of black descent, and this was right after the civil rights movement of 2020. So there's the general understanding of them all working together. Despite that, it did take Hannah a few weeks to actively be a part of the Cookout Alliance, and I remember a lot of people making that accusation that it was due to her being mixed race, and people claiming that Asa intentionally left her out due to this, though Asa herself claimed otherwise and defended herself against that. What I find interesting is that the house called Hannah Chada, which is her last name, and her last name is an Indian last name, since she doesn't like her first name. So them calling her Chada is an acknowledgement of her Indian roots, and I do like that, despite her wanting to know more about her black heritage, black issues, and her becoming more comfortable with that side of herself throughout the season. At the same time, she is still mixed race, and she has the rights to identify as that. And I do feel like she, compared to Kylan, didn't feel like she had much to prove when it comes to her mixed race identity and her blackness. Though I do remember them having a conversation about them kind of feeling that way in their own ways. Though they're mixed, they shouldn't feel like they have to cater to one side or another to prove themselves to one side. You are both, and you are part both, not fully either, but you shouldn't really have to bend yourself to fit another identity, and you have your own special identity. So the next person that I am talking about is Kyland, and he is the main multiracial one, as he is half Black American and half Mexican. But as we've all discussed, Mexican is not a race. But when you look at his mother and the average genetic makeup of Mexicans, they tend to be half white Spaniard and half Amerindian, Native American. So I do think that Khan's mother, who is the Mexican parent, is a mestiza. So that would make Khan a mix of three races, making him multiracial. I do think that because there was a lot more black people than Latino people on the season, and knowing what was happening in real life at the time, he and the others decided to form the Cookout, and Karen is arguably the second most important member of that group, and he really got the ball rolling as he won the second HOH, which caused them to control the direction of the season. And he, as well as Tiffany, did a lot of the manipulating and strategizing for the Alliance to get to where they are. I noticed to his and Xavier's interactions that Xavier kind of wanted to be mixed, where Canon was trying very, very hard to prove how black he is, and he outright admitted this to Hannah, as I've discussed earlier, and I believe I put in another video. But the one thing that absolutely did bother me about Kylan is he was trying to deem who was or was not the best representation of blackness, and he consistently mentioned that Tiffany was not a good black representative or a black winner for XYZ, and it really just rubbed me the wrong way. Because one, who are you as a mixed race man to tell a monoracially black woman that she isn't worthy enough to represent this type of blackness or a black winner based on so and what when you also have the same quote unquote deceitful actions that you are accusing her of having as well? And I noticed with Kylan, just from his other shows, that he tends to latch on to every single identity. Obviously, because that's what he is, but I do feel like he kind of weaponizes it at times or towards his convenience. And that's kind of just weird. And there's definitely a misogynistic element towards the dynamics of the cookout, which could explain some of the misogyny that some black or mixed with black men have. So there was that. And he also downplayed Hannah's contributions to the cookout in the jury roundtable, where he accused her of having the same amount of contributions that Derek had. And they all know that Derek had a minimal contributions. So in general, it kind of just seems like he respected men more than women regarding their contributions. And it kind of reminded me of a lot, or some of those civil rights leaders who kind of took all the credit for stuff that happened in the movement while kind of ignoring what the black woman contributed as well. And in general, he saw Xavier as someone who deserved to take to the end because he saw Xavier as the most like himself, being muscular, strong men, and he kind of valued that image because it was closest to him. And he tends to disvalue anything that is not like that. So I definitely saw that with him and how he interacted with some of the people throughout the season. And we also saw that with him and Asa as well, where he was very condescending towards her the entire season and caused for a lot of awkward interactions there. Okay, so the second to last person that I'm discussing in this video is Amira from Big Brother 24, and she is mixed with black and white. If I remember correctly, I believe it was stated that she grew up a lot more with her white mother and that side of the family. And I do remember a lot of her interactions with Taylor throughout the season just not being very good. She didn't understand where she was coming from. She intentionally misconstrued things that Taylor was talking about. I remember she and Taylor were having a discussion about colorism. Amira pretended to understand, but then she went to Jasmine to essentially shit talk the entire situation and to laugh at it. Just shows how completely up to she was about that, and also a really horrible look. I also remember Amira talking about how she didn't get the point of the cookout, she didn't really get the historical context or the understanding of it. She kind of thought it was pointless, and she kind of took it as a joke when she was described it, since obviously she was recruited on the show in the winter of the year that she was on Big Brother, and she didn't really watch much of the show. So she didn't really take that seriously. But it wasn't until she was nominated and people were calling her all sorts of aggressives and assertives where she finally understood the purpose of the cookout. And while it's good that she finally understood it, it also kind of came off as very convenient. So that was another element that I didn't really like about Amir. And some people are still so mad at her today and they still hate her guts. And I do find it interesting that a lot of these are the same people who will say Amira is not black, but they're so willing to call a biracial man black, and they're so willing to forgive some of the actions of the men, but they hold her to a completely different standard, despite her getting along with a lot of the black alumni and her seemingly learning from her mistakes. But in general, I do think Amira exhibited a lot of the traits that a lot of black people associate with biracial people that don't paint them in the best light, and I think that's why a lot of them still do not like or trust her today, over 2 years later. And the final person in this video is Cedric from Big Brother 26. One, I didn't know that he was partially black at all. He looked, just from his facial features, he looked like Tyler Crispin's sibling. He's very light skinned, and obviously he had curly hair, but curly hair isn't automatically associated with blackness. So I really didn't think he was black at all, and to be fair, he's biracial, not black. And I do find it interesting that whenever I state that, people always get offended by that. There's always so much controversy about that. And these are the same people who are so quick to say Amira isn't black, and they don't pedestalize biracial women either, so I did find that to be Very interesting. So, from what I remember, Cedric grew up mainly with his white family members, so he didn't really. He was more acclimated to that side as well, and based off of where he lived, being more associated with whiteness kind of makes sense. On the season, he got close to Chelsea immediately due to them being mascots due to that stupid twist, and they got close to Cameron as well. So the three of them had that nice kinship there, and that was good for them. Of course, there's the whole Angela situation where they're all, as well as T-Core, kind of grouped together, saying the Black descendant people were all working together, and it caused all that drama, though he himself really wasn't a part of it. I did notice that Cedric's accent kind of changed at various points throughout the season. Sometimes he would talk with a black accent, sometimes it was over exaggerated, and there are other times where he didn't have that at all. So I was wondering if he was kind of putting it on, and if that was put on, it kind of just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't like the way Tucker spoke to him during that whole fight and that issue. I do give Cedric props for remaining very cool, calm, and collected. But I do remember when he was voted out, so many people got so mad at T-Core, called her all types of anti-black slurs and all that, stating that she was anti-black, though a white woman's womb cannot create a black child. Number one. Number two, just the way that Cedric was pedestalized in general by the fan base. I do think some of it had to do with his age. I don't think a lot of it had to do with his personality because there have been black men with his personality as well who haven't gotten the same amount of pedestalization or respect or whatever. And a part of me realized I think people were saying that he is the not the token, but the beacon of black men because he has a lot of white features as well. And it kind of just reminded me of how a lot of people like to pedestalize mixed people to represent blackness. And I think some of that was happening in the fan base with him. And I do think some of his talking was very performative, and I wish he was just more comfortable kind of just being him stuff. But otherwise, Cedric was pretty cool. Holy hell, that was a lot. I literally spent all on this video, and it's 2.5 hours. So, unless I decide to make a spicy white video, which would mainly just consist of Mediterranean people, I think this is it for the Big Brother US racial and ethnic breakdowns. It was interesting to kind of go back and do all this after I rewatched all of the seasons last year, where I definitely got a fresher input and I added a lot more commentary that I missed the first time I did it. So that I definitely do appreciate. And obviously, there were technically three seasons that I needed to update on, and I'm glad that I definitely did that. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Hopefully you all understood or can understand where I am coming from or I came from with all of my talking points regarding this video and the other ones that I've discussed that involved race and ethnic identity. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye!